A man can lose his job, his marriage, his health, and very nearly his life, all because of alcohol, and still sit across from a doctor, a judge, or his own wife, and say, with complete sincerity, "I can handle it," not lying. Not even in denial in the way most people imagine denial, genuinely, honestly convinced. This is perhaps the strangest and most dangerous feature of real alcoholism. It doesn't just damage the body. It rewires the very judgment a person would need to see the damage clearly. So the question worth asking is not simply why alcoholics keep drinking despite the consequences. It's why some of the most intelligent, capable, and self-aware people who can solve enormously complex problems in every other area of their lives, remain completely unable to solve this one. That contradiction sits at the center of everything this chapter set out to explain. By the time the earliest members of Alcoholics Anonymous sat down to describe what they had actually lived through, they understood something that most outside observers, however well-meaning, consistently missed. Ordinary drinkers and real alcoholics were not experiencing the same phenomenon at different intensities. They were experiencing something fundamentally different in kind, not just in degree. A moderate drinker who overindulges occasionally can, without enormous difficulty, decide to cut back and largely follow through. A real alcoholic, once alcohol enters the picture, is dealing with something the book described as a phenomenon of craving, an experience so different from ordinary appetite that comparing the two was, in the author's own words, like comparing a head cold to pneumonia. Both involve the same general territory, but only one of them can actually kill you. One of the most persistent obstacles standing between struggling drinkers and any real solution, according to this chapter, was a particular and remarkably stubborn belief, the conviction, held by nearly every alcoholic at some point, that they would eventually discover the special formula that would let them drink like other people. Not stop entirely, just learn to control it. This belief wasn't presented as foolishness or stupidity. It was presented as one of the defining features of the condition itself, and understanding why it persisted so powerfully turns out to be essential to understanding the entire nature of alcoholism. Nearly every alcoholic described in this chapter had, at some point, run an experiment to prove they could control their drinking. Some tried switching from hard liquor to beer or wine, convinced the problem was the type of drink rather than the drinking itself. Some tried drinking only on weekends, or only in social settings, or only after a certain hour, building elaborate personal rules meant to prove that the issue was really about timing and moderation rather than something deeper. And here is the pattern that repeats itself, case after case, throughout the chapter with almost unsettling consistency. These experiments would work for a while, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. Long enough, in every single case, to convince the person that they had finally cracked the code, that this time really was different, that they had proven, once and for all, that they weren't like those other alcoholics after all. And then, without fail, at some unpredictable moment, often during a period of stress, or sometimes during a moment of celebration when caution seemed unnecessary, the old pattern returned exactly as before, as though the intervening weeks or months of apparent control had never happened at all. This cycle, repeated with such uniformity across so many different individuals, led the early members to a conclusion that ran directly against the conventional wisdom of their time. Willpower, sincerity, and even genuine, desperate motivation were simply not sufficient tools against this particular condition. This wasn't a comfortable conclusion for men who, in nearly every other area of their lives, had built their identities around competence, discipline, and the ability to solve difficult problems through sheer determination. Accepting that this one specific problem could not be solved the same way represented, for many of them, one of the hardest admissions they had ever made. The chapter illustrates this pattern through a series of real accounts drawn from the early members themselves, men whose stories varied enormously in their specific details, but converged on the exact same underlying structure. There was the story of a man who, after a serious health scare directly caused by his drinking, received a clear and unambiguous warning from his doctor that another episode could kill him. He understood this warning completely. He believed it. And within a remarkably short period of time, driven by something that felt, from the inside, less like a choice and more like a compulsion arriving from somewhere outside his own reasoning mind, he was drinking again. There was another account describing a successful, well-respected businessman, a man whose professional judgment was trusted by everyone around him, who nonetheless found himself, again and again, taking that first drink at moments when every rational part of his mind understood exactly what would follow. He wasn't confused about the consequences. He had lived through them repeatedly. And yet, at the critical moment, some other part of his mind seemed to simply override that understanding entirely, presenting the decision to drink not as a dangerous risk but as something that felt, in that specific moment, completely reasonable, even necessary. This particular detail, the sense that the decision to drink often arrived accompanied by a strange and temporary certainty that this time would somehow be different, is one of the most important and most difficult ideas in the entire chapter. The book describes this as a kind of mental blank spot, a peculiar and specific form of forgetting that had nothing to do with general memory problems and everything to do with alcohol specifically. In this blank spot, all of the accumulated evidence of past disasters, all of the promises made to family, all of the physical consequences already suffered, would simply fail to register in the moment it mattered most. The alcoholic wasn't overriding this knowledge through willful defiance. In the moment of picking up that first drink, the knowledge itself seemed to become, temporarily and inexplicably, unavailable. This is a crucial distinction that the chapter works hard to establish, because it directly challenges the assumption, held by nearly everyone outside the fellowship at the time, that alcoholics simply needed to want sobriety badly enough. The men whose stories fill this chapter wanted sobriety desperately. Many of them had every external motivation imaginable. Children who needed them, careers on the verge of complete collapse, spouses who had reached the absolute limit of what they could endure, direct medical warnings about the very real possibility of death. None of this motivation, however genuine and however intense, was sufficient on its own to prevent the same pattern from repeating itself. This is precisely why the chapter insists, with real force, that this condition could not be properly understood as a simple failure of motivation or character. Something else was operating underneath the surface, something that ordinary willpower, no matter how strong, could not reliably reach. The chapter also addresses, directly and without excessive delicacy, a particularly painful subset of cases: individuals who had tried nearly everything available at the time: hospitalization, various medical treatments, religious appeals, family interventions, geographic changes meant to escape old triggers and associations, and who had still, after every single one of these attempts, returned to drinking in exactly the same destructive pattern as before. These accounts were included deliberately, not to induce despair, but to establish, with complete honesty, just how formidable this condition truly was, so that the solution described later in the book would land with the full weight it deserved, rather than being dismissed as some simple technique that anyone could have discovered on their own, with a bit more effort. Within this unflinching description of the problem, the chapter also introduces a distinction that would go on to matter enormously for how the fellowship understood itself going forward: the difference between what it called the real alcoholic and the heavy drinker who, whatever damage their drinking might be causing, still retained a functional ability to stop or moderate once they made a firm decision to do so. This distinction was never framed as a matter of severity, of one group simply drinking larger quantities than the other. It was framed as a difference in the fundamental relationship between the person and the substance itself. Some people, once they take a drink, experience a physical and mental reaction that essentially removes their ability to reliably choose when to stop. Others, even heavy drinkers who might benefit enormously from cutting back, do not experience that same loss of control once drinking has begun. Understanding which category a person genuinely belonged to, the chapter suggests, was itself one of the most important and most difficult pieces of honest self-assessment a struggling drinker could undertake. There's something notably compassionate embedded within this otherwise unflinching chapter, and it's worth pausing on directly. Nowhere does the text suggest that real alcoholics are morally weaker or less intelligent than anyone else. If anything, the accounts collected throughout the chapter go out of their way to describe accomplished, capable, often exceptionally intelligent individuals, doctors, businessmen, professionals of every kind, whose competence in every other area of life stood in stark and almost bewildering contrast to their complete inability to manage this one specific problem. This detail mattered enormously to the earliest members, many of whom had spent years internalizing the belief that their drinking reflected some fundamental personal or moral failure. Reframing the condition as something closer to a distinct physical and mental phenomenon, rather than as evidence of weak character, opened a door that shame and self-blame had kept firmly shut for years in case after case. By laying out this brutally honest portrait, without minimizing how severe and how resistant to ordinary willpower this condition truly was, the chapter accomplishes something essential before the book moves forward into its actual program of recovery. It establishes, beyond any reasonable doubt for the reader who recognizes themselves in these accounts, that partial measures, willpower alone, isolated moments of motivation, even genuine love for one's family had already been tried by people just as sincere and just as desperate, and had already, repeatedly, failed. This wasn't meant to crush hope. It was meant to clear away every remaining illusion of an easier path, so that when the actual solution was introduced, it would be received not as one option among many still worth trying, but as something categorically different from everything that had already been attempted, and had already fallen short. The chapter closes on a note that, in hindsight, changed the entire framework through which alcoholism would be understood by millions of people in the decades that followed. The recognition that the real alcoholic is, in a very specific and very literal sense, powerless over alcohol once the phenomenon of craving has been triggered, and that this powerlessness has nothing to do with a lack of character or a lack of desire to change. It is a condition, distinct and identifiable, with its own particular pattern, its own particular blank spots, and its own particular resistance to every conventional method of correction. And it is precisely because this powerlessness is so complete, so thoroughly documented across so many different individual lives, that the solution the book goes on to describe had to be something entirely different from anything these men had tried before. Not a stronger form of willpower, not a cleverer strategy for moderation. Something else entirely, something that the following chapters were written specifically to explain. The deeper we look into alcoholism, the more we begin to understand that it is not simply a story about drinking. It is a story about a person who has gradually lost the ability to control something that once seemed completely manageable. At first, alcohol may appear to be a choice, a drink after work, a drink with friends, a drink to celebrate, a drink to relax, a drink to forget, a drink to escape, and perhaps there is nothing obviously dangerous about it. But for the alcoholic, something eventually changes. The relationship with alcohol becomes different. What once seemed like a choice can become an obsession. What once seemed like pleasure can become necessity. And what once seemed controllable can eventually become something that controls the person. That is one of the most important lessons of this chapter. The alcoholic may continue believing that they can control their drinking long after their own experience has demonstrated otherwise. They may say, "I will only have one," and sincerely believe it. They may say, "I will never drink again," and sincerely mean it. They may promise their family, they may promise themselves. They may experience consequences so painful that they become absolutely convinced that they are finished with alcohol. And yet, the obsession returns. This is what makes alcoholism so difficult to understand from the outside. A person may appear to have every reason in the world to stop and still drink again. To someone who has never experienced alcoholism, this can seem irrational. It can look like a lack of character, a lack of discipline, a lack of love for the family, a lack of concern for the future. But the deeper reality described in this chapter is far more complicated. The alcoholic may know exactly what alcohol is doing to their life. They may hate it. They may fear it. They may desperately want freedom from it. And yet, knowledge alone does not always protect them when the obsession returns. That is why this chapter is so important. It helps us understand the difference between knowing something is destroying you and having the power to consistently stop doing it. Those are not always the same thing. And perhaps one of the most dangerous beliefs an alcoholic can hold is, I can prove that I can control it this time. That belief can become the beginning of another cycle. Maybe this time it will be different. Maybe I am stronger now. Maybe I have learned my lesson. Maybe I can drink only on weekends. Maybe I can drink only beer. Maybe I can drink only one. Maybe I can control the amount. Maybe I can control the situation. Maybe I can stop tomorrow. But the problem is not always the first drink. The problem is what happens after the alcoholic crosses that invisible line. Once the obsession is activated, the promises made while sober can become distant memories. And this is why the Big Book asks the reader to look honestly at their own experience. Not at what they wish were true, not at what they want others to believe, but at what has actually happened. How many times have you promised yourself you would stop? How many times did you intend to have only 1 or 2 drinks? How many times did you wake up regretting what happened? How many times did you say never again? And how many times did never again eventually become just one more time? These questions are uncomfortable, but recovery often begins with uncomfortable honesty, because as long as a person can convince themselves that the problem is under control, there may be little reason to seek a different solution. Denial protects the addiction. Honesty begins to challenge it. And perhaps the greatest courage in recovery is not the courage to appear strong. It is the courage to admit, my experience has shown me that I cannot safely control my drinking. That statement can feel like surrender. But it can also be the beginning of freedom. Because when you stop fighting reality, you can finally begin working with it. You no longer need to prove that you are different. You no longer need to test yourself. You no longer need to see whether you can drink successfully this time. You can stop conducting experiments with your own life. And perhaps that is one of the greatest lessons of More About Alcoholism. The alcoholic does not need another experiment. They need honesty. They need understanding. They need help. They need connection. And they need a new way of living. The chapter also shows us something else that is deeply important. Alcoholism can create an enormous gap between intention and behavior. A person can love their family and still hurt them. They can value their career and still jeopardize it. They can want to be responsible and still behave irresponsibly. They can sincerely want to change and still repeat the same behavior. That contradiction can create enormous shame, and shame can become another reason to drink. The person drinks because they feel terrible. Then they feel terrible because they drank. Then they drink again because they cannot tolerate how terrible they feel. The cycle becomes self-perpetuating. And eventually, the person may begin to believe that they are fundamentally broken. But there is an important distinction. Having an addiction does not mean being worthless. A person can be responsible for their actions without being permanently defined by them. Recovery does not require pretending that the damage never happened. It requires facing the damage honestly. It requires taking responsibility. It requires making changes. It requires learning. It requires becoming different. But shame alone does not create transformation. Responsibility can. And this is where recovery becomes more than simply stopping alcohol. It becomes a process of rebuilding a life where honesty replaces deception, where connection replaces isolation, where responsibility replaces excuses, where service replaces self-centeredness, where spiritual growth replaces the constant attempt to control everything, and where the person begins to discover that sobriety is not simply about what they stop doing. It is also about what they begin doing. They begin showing up. They begin listening. They begin helping. They begin repairing relationships. They begin facing uncomfortable emotions. They begin taking responsibility for their actions. They begin discovering that life without alcohol does not have to be empty. It can actually become fuller. But perhaps one of the most powerful messages of this chapter is the warning against overconfidence. Because sometimes a person can experience a period of sobriety and begin thinking, maybe I am cured. Maybe enough time has passed. Maybe I have learned enough. Maybe I can handle one drink. And that thought can be incredibly dangerous for someone whose experience has repeatedly shown that controlled drinking is not possible. Recovery requires humility, not humiliation. Humility, the willingness to recognize reality without needing to argue with it. The willingness to say, this is what happened to me. This is what alcohol does to me. This is what I have learned from my experience. And from that honesty comes a different kind of strength. Not the strength of saying, I can control anything, but the strength of saying, I know what I cannot safely control, and I will live accordingly. That is wisdom. And perhaps the most important battle is not against alcohol itself. It is against the thinking that tells us we can return to the old way without consequences. Because alcoholism often begins long before the drink is poured. It begins with a thought, a justification, a romantic memory, a belief that this time will be different, a desire to escape, a moment of resentment, a feeling of loneliness, a thought that says, I deserve one. And if that thought is not examined, it can become the doorway back to the old cycle. This is why recovery requires more than physical abstinence. It requires awareness. It requires learning to recognize the thinking that can lead us back to destructive behavior. And perhaps that is one of the reasons the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous is so important. A person does not have to face these thoughts alone. They can talk to another alcoholic. They can attend a meeting. They can share what is happening inside them. They can hear someone else's experience. They can be reminded of where the old way leads. And sometimes a simple conversation can interrupt a dangerous thought before it becomes an action. That is the power of fellowship. One person reminds another, you don't have to go back there. And perhaps that is one of the greatest gifts of recovery. The person who once believed they had to fight everything alone discovers that they don't. They can ask for help. They can listen. They can learn. They can serve. They can become part of something larger than themselves. And eventually, their own experience can become a source of hope for someone else. The person who once felt ashamed of their story may one day tell that story to another suffering alcoholic. And suddenly, the past has a different meaning. The pain has not disappeared. The mistakes have not disappeared. But they have become useful. The experience that once seemed meaningless can now help another person recognize themselves. And perhaps that is one of the most beautiful transformations in recovery. The story that once represented destruction can eventually become a story of service. So as we close this chapter, we should remember that more about alcoholism is not simply trying to frighten us with the consequences of drinking. It is trying to help us understand the nature of the problem. Because you cannot effectively confront a problem you refuse to understand. The chapter asks us to look beyond the bottle, beyond the behavior, beyond the consequences. It asks us to look at the thinking, the obsession, the inability to control the drinking once it begins, and the repeated return to alcohol despite devastating consequences. And perhaps that understanding can lead to one of the most important realizations in recovery. The solution is not to become better at controlling alcohol. The solution is to stop trying to control something that has repeatedly demonstrated that it cannot be safely controlled. That may sound like weakness, but it is actually an extraordinary act of honesty. There is freedom in no longer having to negotiate with alcohol. No longer asking, can I have one? Can I drink tonight? Can I control it? Can I stop tomorrow? No more promises, no more experiments, no more bargaining, no more pretending. Just a clear decision to live differently. And that decision can open the door to an entirely different life. A life where mornings are not filled with regret, where relationships can begin to heal, where trust can slowly be rebuilt, where the mind becomes clearer, where the person can begin discovering who they are without alcohol, where fear can be faced, where pain can be processed, where purpose can be found, where service can become meaningful, where another day of sobriety becomes more valuable than another night of escape. And perhaps that is where this chapter ultimately leaves us. Not with condemnation, not with hopelessness, but with clarity. The clarity to recognize the problem, the humility to accept help, the willingness to stop fighting reality, and the courage to begin living differently. Because alcoholism can convince a person that they have no choice. But recovery begins when they discover that there is another possibility. There is another way. There is another life. And perhaps the first step toward that life is simply telling the truth. The truth about what alcohol has done. The truth about what we have tried. The truth about what has failed. The truth about our inability to control it. And finally, the truth that we do not have to continue living that way. Because the past may explain how we arrived here, but it does not have to determine where we go next. And if there is one message to carry from this chapter, perhaps it is this. Do not let one more promise become one more relapse. Do not let one more experiment become one more disaster. Do not let shame convince you that you are beyond help. And do not let pride prevent you from accepting the help that can save your life. There is nothing weak about admitting the truth. There is nothing shameful about asking for help. There is nothing hopeless about beginning again. Sometimes the strongest thing an alcoholic can say is simply, I finally understand what alcohol does to me. And once that understanding becomes honest, a new life can begin, one day at a time. One choice at a time, one meeting at a time, one step at a time, one sober day at a time.